Well, we're starting something new. I like starting something new because it's an adventure. We get to dive into something that's going to change kind of the way we've been thinking for the past number of weeks, if not months. You know, when we go to a new book of the Bible and start studying it, or maybe a new topic, we need to realize that our context completely changes. Okay, we cannot read Esther the same way we read 1 Peter. There's two completely different contexts. And so what we want to do tonight is really what we want to do every time we start talking about a new book. We want to look at the context. We want to look at some critical issues, kind of some things that are going on in the back of our minds while we're reading this text. It will help us as we read the text, and I hope that you are excited about diving into the book of Esther. And after we finish the book of Esther, we're going to dive into the book of Ruth. So we're going to look at two key women in the Old Testament here, and their significance even for us today. Now, the book of Esther is an interesting book, and we want to begin by looking at the theme phrase and the theme verse. Now, if you have been in any of my classes for any number of times, I like to assign a theme verse and a theme phrase to all books. I think that makes it easier to study. It helps you remember what the book is about. And so our theme verse is by far the most famous verse from the book of Esther. Esther chapter 4 and verse 14. You probably don't even have to look it up. You probably already know what it says. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Now, just the same way as we take verses in various other places in the Bible, and we take them and we put them on these nice plaques, and we make posters and pictures, and we hang them in our house and other places that we may go, our offices, our schools. This is one of those. But the problem is we cut off the verse and we say, for such a time as this. Right? And we take that and we just throw it around willy-nilly. You know, for such a time as this, for such a time as this. Oh, well, you had a bad day today. Well, for such a time as this. And we get so lost in that we really forget what Mordecai is telling Esther here in this particular verse. The whole future of God's people rested on this verse, on these words. And when we get to chapter 4, we'll look at that a lot more in depth, but I'm excited for that. Really what we need to know about this theme verse is that this is the climax of the Esther narrative. And so when you think, what is the book of Esther about? Esther 4:14. She was brought up for such a time as this. What's our theme phrase? Our theme phrase is the power of the pawn, or the power of a pawn, I should say. The power of a pawn. How many of you like to play chess? Anybody? Okay, I'm not the only nerd. Good. I love playing chess. When I was in middle school, I had asthma really, really bad. I still do, but not near to the extent that I did. And when I was in middle school, I had to take a science class with all the athletes because all the normal kids went to gym in fourth period. The athletes had science class in fourth period, and then the athletes would go practice basketball in fifth period. Okay, so that kind of overlap. I went to science class while everybody else went to gym. Every Friday in our science class, we could play board games. I always chose chess. Now, I'm not the greatest at chess. Okay, chess is one of those games, it's a mental game. You have to think 2, 3, sometimes 4 moves ahead in order to do what you want to do. But I got to be very good at chess because I learned not to underestimate the power of a pawn. You see, in chess, a pawn is the weakest piece on the chessboard. It can only move one spot at a time, with the exception of the very first move. Very first move, it can move 2 spaces forward. It can only move forward, but it can attack diagonally in a forward motion. So, pawn's very limited. And what my opponents would always do is they would sacrifice their pawns so that they're more powerful pieces, like the queen and the bishop and all of those, that they could have more power, right? Well, if you learn how to sacrifice pieces in a way that they need to be sacrificed, you can use a pawn. A pawn can take out a king, right? A pawn can take out the queen. So you have to learn how to use those pieces. What you find in the book of Esther, I love comparing the book of Esther to a chess game, because God is the master controller of the pieces. And you have God making a move, and then you have Haman or Ahasuerus or others making moves, and it all comes together kind of like a beautiful drama. Okay? Now, Esther, in the grand scheme of things, is nothing. You say, oh, but she was royalty. Yeah, along with about 500 other women. Okay? Oh, but she was chosen for this purpose. Yes, she was. But she, in the world, did not have the status that she needed. I mean, it wasn't like she could just go in as a woman and tell them how it was going to be. But God used her. Right? God used her, as I like to say, to take down the knight, Haman. Okay? So I love the book of Esther because it shows us that we all can be used by God. There is no such thing as an insignificant Christian. None of us are insignificant in the eyes of God. Let's get into some contextual things, some critical things here. Who wrote the book? Don't say Esther. When you read the book of Esther, we don't know. We don't know who wrote it. Nowhere in the book of Esther does it tell us who wrote it. Here are some theories. You can take your own. I think one is just as viable as the next. I'll tell you which one I believe it is, but you can certainly have your own opinion. Some people think that it was Joachim, the high priest, who was the high priest during the time of Judith. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's a lot of people who believe that the book of Esther does not belong in the Bible. Okay, and we'll talk about why, and why I believe it certainly should be included in the Bible. But one reason is because if you say that it's written or dated later than what it really is, and you say that Joachim wrote it, that's during the intertestamental period, whenever all of these apocryphal books and pseudepigraphal books were being written. So I mark him out, other people don't. The Talmud says that the men of the great synagogue wrote it. We don't have any proof of that. I want to come back to Mordecai here in just a moment. Augustine, who is a church father, Augustine said that Ezra wrote it. There is a lot of evidence to support that, but again, we really just don't know. Really, here's what we do know. It was a Jew familiar with the Persian court. Now, commentators and scholars will throw that other word up there that really throws out that option, an unknown Jew. Well, I'm not going to go that far, but we do know that it was a Jew. We do know that they were familiar with the Persian court because the practices of the Persian court are very important in the book of Esther, and they're going to come up time and time again. So let's go back to Mordecai. Honestly, folks, that's who I think wrote it. The book of Esther, by the way, just a quick show of hands, just for my own knowledge, how many of you have read the book of Esther front to back in one setting before? Okay, if you haven't done that, go home tonight or do it sometime tomorrow and read it. It's only 10 chapters, but chapter 10 is only 3 verses long. Okay, it's not going to take you forever. It's really quick, and it's such a beautiful story and narrative that you're able to read it without losing your attention. It's a beautiful story. Read it in one setting. The story has very little to do with Esther. It has a great deal to do with Mordecai. And so I wonder if Mordecai, which Josephus and Clement of Alexandria agree that Mordecai wrote the book of Esther. And it makes perfect sense because the things that are significant in this book have to do with Mordecai rather than Esther. We'll see that whenever we get into the book. So here's, all that being said, here's the end game. We don't know who wrote the book. Do we need to? No. We don't. It doesn't matter. But here's what it had to be. It had to be an eyewitness to the Persian court. Okay, because we're going to find details about the Persian court that no one else would have known. And they would have had to have been an eyewitness to that story because there are detailed events of that story. I printed my slides out differently, so I've turned when I shouldn't have. Sorry about that. When was it written? Well, during the Persian period. Chapter 1 and verse 1 makes that very clear. These are during the days of Ahasuerus. Okay, so during the Persian period, the Septuagint and Josephus say Artaxerxes in chapter 1 and verse 1 rather than Ahasuerus. Now, why is that such a big deal? Because you don't find Ahasuerus anywhere else aside from Hebrew scriptures. Most scholars believe that this is Xerxes I, who reigned from 486 to 465 BC. Okay, so the Septuagint, I guess I need to make it a little bit clearer. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. This is the Bible that Jesus would have been familiar with. Okay, and Josephus is a Jewish historian. So they're trying to show who to the rest of the world was reigning at this time, but most scholars and commentators believe this is Xerxes I. Xerxes I really fits a lot better because Xerxes I's father was Darius, and Darius had tried so fervently to take over Greece, and he was never able to do that. And then Xerxes come along, and this is what you find in chapter 1, that Xerxes was planning to overthrow Greece, and he goes on a 2-year campaign to do that and gets absolutely whipped. And then he comes back with his tail tucked. Okay, that fits perfectly with the context of Esther chapter 1 and I think the beginning of chapter 2. Now, we said earlier that there are a lot of people who believe Esther doesn't belong in the Bible. Why is that? Well, probably what you found by now in our Wednesday night auditorium classes like this is that there's people who believe every book doesn't belong in the Bible. But when we looked at 2 Peter not too long ago, the main reason was because of authorship. You know, who wrote 2 Peter? It says Peter wrote it, but how do we know? 2 Peter is so different from 1 Peter. Well, Esther has a lot more weight as to why people believe it shouldn't be in the Bible. I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying there's a lot more that they have to throw out. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So first of all, the name of God never appears in the book of Esther. You've probably heard that before. The covenant name of God never appears once. Prayer never appears. You say, well, what about fasting in chapter 4 whenever Esther calls the capital of Susa to fast for 3 days? And by the way, this was not just going without food. We'll talk more about this when we get there. But it was what they call it a total fast. No sleep, no water, no food for 3 days. Well, I think prayer is implied, but prayer is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Worship is never spoken of. Jerusalem's never mentioned. The law is only mentioned in one oblique reference. How many of you are familiar with the Qumran caves, the Qumran discovery? Anybody? Fantastic. All right. Story goes like this. Little boy was out one day and he wound up coming upon these caves, and inside these caves he found these pots, and in the pots he thought there would be treasure. So he opens up the pots and he doesn't find treasure, he finds something way more valuable. He finds ancient documents, well preserved, perfectly preserved. And so scholars come back and they look at these documents and they say, these are books of the Bible that we had no idea ever existed. I think the discovery was in the 1940s. Somebody with a smartphone can Google and check that for me. But look up Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of you may have heard of Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls are found at Qumran, okay? They're one and the same. At Qumran, this is likely an Essene community. Do we remember who the Essenes were? The Essenes were an early Jewish group alongside of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They lived in communities off by themselves and were kind of really extremist with the law of Moses. So this is likely an Essene community. At Qumran, they found fragments of every single book of the Bible except Esther. That's interesting. Why didn't they have Esther? Okay, now that again I think is, from the liberal perspective, I think that's an argument from silence. Just because they didn't have it doesn't mean it's not important. Okay, so, but just an interesting fact I thought you might like to see. Martin Luther, which we're all, I'm sure, familiar with. Martin Luther nailed the 99 Theses on the Catholic Church door, the beginner of the Reformation movement. He believed that the book of Esther should not be included in the canon. I don't think he included it in his Bible, so one of y'all can check me on that. When the Council of Pharisees at the Jamnia Council in AD 90 sat down and developed, well, I don't want to say developed. When they sat down and determined a set list of Old Testament books, the canon, they decided to include it because it gives the background for the Feast of Purim. Okay, now, I want you to make sure you understand what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. What I am saying is that there was a group of people who sat down and said, let's look at all of the books that we have that are valuable and see which ones are inspired and which ones are not. Okay, I'm not saying that there was a group of people who said these are inspired and these are not because we say so and we're just going to go with the list that we think is best. So I think sometimes we look at these councils and things like that and we say, well, they made the canon. No, the canon was already made. It's just they came up with the guidelines to say, these are the ones that already fit the criteria and these are the ones that don't. Okay? So to answer why it's in our Bible, there's criteria for the Old Testament just like there's criteria for the New Testament as to why books are included and not included. For example, in the New Testament, for a book to be included, it has to have apostolic authority. Right? We went over this when we looked at 2 Peter. Okay? 2 Peter claims to be written by Peter. It has apostolic authority. The Old Testament, for books to be included, they have to have some type of historical value. And so Esther certainly fits that bill. It gives us historical value. It tells us about the origins of the Feast of Purim. And we'll look at the Feast of Purim a little bit more here in just a moment. When you look at the book of Esther, you cannot miss that the author knew specifics about the geography around Susa and was very familiar with the Persian court. This is very important because, archaeology gets a bad rap. People look at archaeology and they say, well, how do you know? Yeah, you found it, but how do you know that that's really what it is? Well, archaeology has proven that there was a palace in Susa that fits the description of Esther. Okay, that's a big deal, right? So it's definitely a historical document. When you look at Esther in Hebrew, the Hebrew of Esther is very good, very grammatically correct, which implies that there had to be someone who was educated in Hebrew writing to write the book. Okay. This is why Ezra gets a lot of credit for being the author. Whether he is or not, we don't know. But Ezra was a scribe. To be a scribe, one has to know how to write. Yes. Okay. Now, and people will say, well, Mordecai wouldn't have known that. Yes, he would have. Yes, he would have. Because by the end of Esther, we see Mordecai is now part of the Persian court. To be part of the Persian court, you have to know how to write. He would have known how to write in Hebrew and in the languages that surrounded probably as well. When you look at the end of chapter 10, everyone do me a favor real quick and look at Esther chapter 10 in your Bibles. I highly, highly doubt this is the case. But me being curious, I'll chase the rabbit while the rabbit runs. Does anyone's Bible go beyond verse 3? Everybody's Bible has chapter 10, verses 1, 2, and 3. Nobody's goes beyond 3. Okay, that's what I thought. And that's good reason. But it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us to say, well, why does chapter 10 only have 3 verses in it? I mean, don't you think that they could have, that whoever put the chapter and verse divisions in there could have just made chapter 9 go on a little bit longer? Well, the Septuagint, which again is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, adds a whole chapter to the book of Esther. And you can go in our library. I believe we have a translated copy of the Septuagint. If it's not translated, I think we do have a copy of the Septuagint. And you can see that chapter 10 continues. So, does chapter 10 need to stop at verse 3, or does it need to continue? Well, most scholars believe, and I think rightly so, that chapter 10, the continuation, is an insertion by later scribes to show Mordecai as coming to power in Persia and in Susa. Okay? Don't think it was original to the original Hebrew text. That's why it's not found in our Bibles. But somebody may look at that and say, well, this one has chapter 10, verses 1, 2, and 3. This one has it much more. Which one is it? Well, the evidence stacks up that it was added much later. This book, I want to go on to the next slide here because that gives a little more information. The book of Esther is part of the 5 Megillot. The Megillot is a collection of books that are read at specific holy days, at specific feasts in the Jewish community. There are 5 of them: Esther, Ruth, Song of Solomon, Lamentations, and Ecclesiastes. This is very interesting because Song of Solomon is one of those books that's read at these feasts. I think that's incredibly interesting because there are both Jewish and Christian, ancient Jewish and ancient Christian historians that say until every other book of the Bible has been memorized, the Song of Solomon should not be read. Which basically means don't ever read the Song of Solomon. But here it's one of these books that are read at these feast days. The Feast of Purim commemorates a time when the Jewish people living in Persia were saved from their extermination. That, I didn't cite it up here, but that is a verbatim quote from the Jewish Virtual Library. So if you were to ask a Jew today, what is the Feast of Purim? They would tell you it is a feast designed to remember this day. Over and over and over and over and over and over again in the Old Testament, you have certain things that are implemented to be reminders of specific events. Right? Read the book of Joshua and see how many times Joshua built an altar so that when your children pass by this and they say, "Daddy, what is that?" you can tell them, this commemorates the time that we won this victory. You think about fast days, think about feast days, they were all there to commemorate this particular time. I believe we should view the Lord's Supper in the same way. The Lord's Supper is a time where we have emblems that cause us to remind us of something that happened that is significant, that we don't want to lose from our memory. In the Feast of Purim, the same way. So let's look at an outline here of the book of Esther. It's pretty straightforward. What you find is that this book reads like a play, which I love. And we're probably going to move through the book of Esther relatively quickly when we actually get into the text, because you can't have one part without another. It's just so continuous and moves so fluidly. So in chapter 1, we're introduced to Ahasuerus, Vashti. We see that Ahasuerus has gone on a campaign, or is preparing for a campaign, and comes back, and that Vashti is removed. She's stripped of her royal title, and we'll talk about that because no offense to those of you who like VeggieTales, but VeggieTales got the story wrong in very, very many places, okay? And then in chapter 2, we're introduced to Esther, if only briefly. Chapter 3, we're introduced to Haman. Chapter 4, Esther is given the challenge of going and trying to get the king to change his decree. That's going to prove to be very dangerous because the law of the Medes and Persians cannot be changed, which we'll talk about again here in just a little bit. We'll have the plan and the providence of God at work in chapters 5 through 7. The decree will be changed in chapter 8, and we'll have the Feast of Purim to round us up in chapters 9 and 10. So we have 6 characters that I want to go over here really quickly. The first one is King Ahasuerus. He's the king of Persia. He has a lot of land, 127 provinces, I think. Verse 1 says it may be 128. Somebody can correct me on that. So 127 provinces. It's the world power at the time. Okay, he's a dude that's in charge. He is on the chessboard the king. Now, a king on the chessboard can only move one space at a time in any direction. When you see Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, he doesn't move very much. He doesn't do very much. He doesn't have a very big role in the overall scheme of things, but he is a significant piece that you don't want to get rid of. And then you have Esther, who is the queen. Right? She's the queen on the chessboard. She is moving back and forth all over the place. She's being used all the time. She's making move 1, move 2, move 3, move 4, all over the board. Vashti, she is really, she's the first pawn to make the move, right? She's the first one to be taken off the board. She's there and then she's gone. We really don't have much information about her. Haman is the knight. Every time you see Haman move, he moves crooked. If you're familiar with chess, a knight can only move in an L shape. Okay, so every time the knight moves, he moves in a crooked way. Haman is the same way. Every time he moves crooked. And he has a pride problem, bless his heart. Mordecai, another pawn. He's virtually a nobody until the very end. Now, in chess, some people play it this way, some people don't. Okay, I always played it this way. But in chess, when a pawn makes it to the other end of the board, the pawn turns into a queen. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that Mordecai became a queen, but I'm saying that Mordecai attained royalty. All right? He made it to the end of the board, attained royalty. And then you have the Jewish people. You say, well, the Jewish people don't have a big role in this book. Yes, they do. Esther got the entirety of the Jewish people in Susa to fast for her for 3 days, a total fast. The Jewish people had a lot to do with this particular story. Now, let me make sure I'm where I need to be here. Okay, let's look at the first 4 verses in the last 5 minutes that we have. I hate to get into the text and then have to leave, but this really sets up the context for what we're going to see with chapter 1 and a little bit into chapter 2. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors and provinces were before him. While he showed the riches of his royal glory and splendor and pomp and greatness for many days, 180 days. Now the question is, was there a 180-day feast? Were there 2 feasts here, one for 180 days and one for 7 days? What's going on here with Ahasuerus and his feast? Well, Herodotus, who is an ancient historian, really gives us a lot of information about the Persian Wars. And Herodotus tells us that these princes and these people were together for 180 days, and at the end of the 180 days, for 7 days, they had a feast. What they were doing during that time is they were trying to come up with a plan to do what Darius never could do, and that's conquer Greece. Okay? They wanted to conquer Greece. So that's what they're talking about. That's what they're doing. Notice here where it says he sat on his royal throne. It talks about all of this riches and splendor in verse 4. There was there's so much riches, so many riches and splendors in Persia that Herodotus found it difficult to describe. Herodotus puts it this way. In Herodotus chapter 7 and verse 27, he says that Xerxes was the richest man in the world. Now, you got to be pretty rich to be the richest man in the world. I mean, this guy had everything. Now, we need to take a step back. There's one mistake that we make in studying the Bible, and I told our ladies class this morning, is that many times we look at the text the same way we look at a superhero movie. You've got the good guy who's always good. You've got the bad guy who's always bad. And we forget that people are people. Okay. There's so much good in the worst of us and so much bad in the best of us. A yin and yang kind of thing, right? Look at who we're talking about. Look at the king. Now, I know many of you are jumping ahead and you're thinking about Esther and how she approaches the king. It's not like how we are today where we're like, well, I'm going to approach the president. Yes, that's a daunting task to say, I'm going to go approach the president. Okay? You have to go through different layers. You have to go through the Secret Service. You have to do all these things to approach the president. But this is, without question, the most powerful human being in the world at this time. And you've got this little girl who's going to change it all. Now, notice here that he's throwing this banquet, he's throwing this party. What we're going to find in verse 5 and following is that Queen Vashti is also throwing a banquet. And that Ahasuerus is going to ask for her presence at his banquet. We'll talk about what she's doing with her banquet a little bit later. But to just set the stage for what we're going to talk about next week, what was it that the king did not like about Vashti? As you all probably know the story, I highly doubt that there's anyone in here, there may be, I don't want to make an assumption, I highly doubt there's anyone in here who hasn't heard this story before, in some form or another. Now, what I always heard is that because Vashti refused to come, because she just smarted off to the king, that he had her executed or banished. Right? VeggieTales says, banished to the land of tickling. What a terrible place. Between now and next week, read the story of Esther. Here's your homework. Read the story of Esther all the way through, but read it twice. And come back next week and tell me what you think. Why did the king have such a problem with Queen Vashti? All right, I'm out of time. We covered some good ground. We'll get